The winter air cut through the threadbare coat of Malachia's walker as his fingers moved across his violin strings in an intricate dance. Each musical note ascended like smoke into the gray Louisiana sky. Sunday afternoon, January 12, 1869, found Lafayette Square pulsing with the restless energy of a world fundamentally transformed. 4 years had passed since the war's conclusion. Yet for men like Colonel Silas Thorne, the conflict persisted eternally in their hearts. Malachias remained unaware of the Colonel's approach initially. His eyes stayed closed, immersed in the melody flowing from that battered instrument in his grip. That violin carried age within it, deep antiquity even, its protective varnish worn down to a soft sheen through generations of use. Its wooden body marked and weathered by time. Yet when Malachias performed, it produced a voice transcending its humble exterior completely. That sound emerged pure as crystal, achingly lovely in its perfection. It represented something that should never have existed in a world so cruel and relentless as this one. Before continuing this remarkable narrative, please subscribe to our channel and indicate which city you're listening from in the comments. Our thanks to you. Now let's return to our tale. The assembled listeners formed a half circle, their expressions mixing wonder with visible discomfort. Freedmen like Malachias stood there, their Sunday finest pressed and neat, their faces still learning dignity's expression without underlying fear. Poor whites were present too, their bitterness evident in clenched jaws and narrowed eyes. And there stood the former aristocrats, planters and merchants whose existence had crumbled like a card house when the Confederacy fell. Now they clung desperately to pride's wreckage, like shipwrecked sailors grasping floating debris. Colonel Silas Thorne belonged among that final group, though death would have been preferable to admitting any shared connection with others. At 53 years old, bitterness had hollowed him completely. His once attractive face now displayed permanent anger's mapping lines. Thornwood, his plantation, still occupied Lafayette's outskirts, but merely as a shadow of its previous grandeur. The fields sat untended now. The main house fell steadily into decay, and the colonel's wealth had dissipated like morning mist beneath an unrelenting sun. Yet what consumed Silas Thorne more than poverty, more than defeat, more than the humiliation of watching former slaves walk freely through his streets, was that violin sound, that cursed instrument in that young man's possession. The music stopped abruptly. Opening his eyes, Malachias discovered the colonel positioned directly before him, close enough to smell whiskey on the man's breath and observe the broken capillary network across his nose. Silence fell over the crowd as they sensed electricity charging the atmosphere, that promise of violence trailing Silas Thorne like his personal shadow. "That's quite an instrument you have there, boy," Thorne said, his voice deceptively gentle. Something in his tone caused several listeners to instinctively retreat a step. "Where would someone like you acquire such a thing?" Malachias's jaw tightened, yet his voice emerged steady when he responded. "It was presented to me, sir, by someone who desired my possession of it." "Presented to you?" Thorne echoed as though tasting the words and finding them bitter. "And who, might I ask, would give such a valuable instrument to the likes of you?" Something strange was occurring in the colonel's face, something exceeding simple racist contempt. His eyes fixed on that violin with an intensity approaching recognition, and his hands had started trembling slightly. Was this rage? Or perhaps something else entirely? Something more complex? A gentleman who believed music belonged to those capable of playing it. Malachias answered carefully. He drew the violin closer to his chest, a protective gesture that didn't escape notice. "A gentleman." Thorne spat the word like poison. "Let me examine it. With respect, sir. I'd prefer not to." The colonel's hand shot forward faster than seemed possible for a man his age, his fingers closing around the violin's neck. Malachias instinctively pulled back, and for a moment both men remained frozen in a grotesque tug of war. The instrument suspended between them. The crowd pressed closer, drawn by the spectacle despite themselves. "Release it, boy," Thorn hissed. Something desperate colored his voice now, something transcending simple cruelty. "Release it before I—" "Please," Malachias said, the word emerging as barely a whisper. "Please, sir, it's everything I have." And that marked the moment Silas Thorn reached his decision. With violent force, he tore the violin from Malachias's grasp, held it momentarily overhead as if displaying a trophy, then slammed it down with full strength against the square's stone pavement. The sound of splintering wood cracked through the air like gunfire. The violin's body split open, strings snapping with musical screams, the bridge flying free like a wounded bird in flight. Thorn raised it again and smashed it down once more, then repeatedly, until what had been beautiful lay reduced to scattered broken pieces across the cold stone floor. The ensuing silence was absolute. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Malachias remained frozen, his empty hands still raised where they'd been when the instrument was torn away. His eyes fixed on the wreckage at his feet. Colonel Thorn stood over the destroyed violin, his chest heaving with exertion, his face flushed with something that might have been triumph, or perhaps something darker, more desperate. He turned to face the crowd, his eyes sweeping across their shocked expressions. "Let this serve as a lesson," he declared, his voice carrying across the silent square. "To all of you. Some things simply don't belong in the hands of your kind. Certain things will never be yours, regardless of what paperwork the Washington government sends down here." Yet as he spoke, something unexpected transpired. His eyes fell again upon the wreckage, and his expression transformed. The flush drained from his features, replaced by something resembling fear. He stepped back once, then again, as if the broken wooden pieces on the ground had suddenly become threatening. What had he observed? What detail amid the destruction had captured his attention? Malachias hadn't noticed the colonel's reaction. He was already kneeling, his hands moving carefully through the debris, gathering the fragments as tenderly as if they were a beloved friend's remains. His face remained utterly still, revealing nothing of his emotions. Yet his hands trembled as they worked, sorting through splinters and fragments. "Malachias," a voice said softly. Reverend Johnson stood there, pastor of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, a tall man with graying hair and eyes that had witnessed too much suffering to be surprised by fresh cruelty. "Son, leave it. It's gone. Come away now." But Malachias didn't respond. He continued gathering the pieces, his movements methodical, almost ritualistic in nature. And as he worked, as his fingers traced the broken edges of what had been his most precious possession, he sensed something strange, something that shouldn't exist there. One larger piece, part of the violin's back, felt wrong in his hands. Too light, too hollow, and there was an edge, a seam where solid wood should have been continuous. His fingers discovered a crack extending deeper than Thorn's violence had caused. This crack was old, deliberate, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. And now, with the instrument destroyed, the crack had widened just enough to reveal something concealed for many years. Malachias's breath caught in his throat, his hands stilled completely. Around him, people were beginning to move again, to whisper, to shake their heads and disperse. The spectacle had concluded. Colonel Thorn had already turned and was walking away, his shoulders rigid, his gait unsteady. But Malachias perceived none of this because his fingers had just discovered that his violin had been keeping secrets. And if his suspicion proved correct, then the previous 5 minutes had transformed everything in ways no one could yet fathom. What lay hidden within that violin? Why had Conal Thorne's expression shifted so dramatically when viewing the wreckage? And who had originally given this instrument to Malachius? Reverend Johnson crouched beside him, placing a comforting hand on the young man's shoulder. "Come along, son. Mrs. Patterson will provide your supper. You can stay with us this evening." "Reverend," Malachius said quietly, his voice strange and distant. "I need to return home immediately." "Malachius, there's nothing. Please." The young man looked up, and something in his eyes gave the Reverend pause. Not grief, not anger, but rather an electric intensity speaking of sudden comprehension. "I must go home. There's something requiring my attention." He stood, cradling the larger violin pieces in his arms like precious cargo, leaving the smaller splinters behind. Without another word, without glancing at anyone, he began walking rapidly away from the square, heading toward the modest cabin collection on the town's eastern edge where Friedman lived. The crowd watched him depart, confused by his sudden exit. Several people shook their heads, assuming the boy was simply overwhelmed with emotion, retreating to grieve privately. They would soon learn how mistaken they were. Conal Thorne, now half a block distant, stopped walking. He stood perfectly motionless in the middle of the street, his back to the square, his head slightly tilted as if listening for something. Then, without warning, he turned and looked back. His eyes found Malachius's retreating figure, and his face went pale. No, he whispered to himself. No, he couldn't have. He wouldn't have. But whom was he discussing? And what couldn't or wouldn't they have done? Thorne's hand went to his coat pocket, fumbling for something. He withdrew a silver pocket watch, flipped it open, and stared at the time. Then he looked back toward the square, toward his own house in the distance, and reached a decision. He began walking quickly in the opposite direction from his home, heading toward Bertram Coates's law offices on Main Street. Meanwhile, Malachius was nearly running now, his arms full of broken wood, his mind racing. The cabin he shared with his mother and younger sister came into view. A small structure with a patched roof and smoke rising from its chimney. His mother would be inside preparing Sunday dinner. She would ask questions. He would need to explain what had occurred. But first, he had to examine what he'd discovered. He had to be certain. The violin had been given to him 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1866, by an elderly white man named Tobias Thorne, the colonel's father, Thornwood Plantation's patriarch, a man who had ruled his small kingdom with absolute authority for 4 decades. And on his deathbed, burning with fever, Tobias Thorne had summoned one person and one person only. He had called for Malachius. Why had the old master wanted to see a young freedman during his final hours? Why had he given him the violin with such urgency, such strange intensity? And why had he extracted Malachius's promise with his dying breath, never to let anyone take it from him? Keep it safe, Tobias had whispered, his papery hand gripping Malachius's wrist with surprising strength. Keep it close. No matter what happens, promise me. Malachius had promised, not understanding, not questioning. The old man had been kind to him in his way, had taught him to play when he was just a child working in Thornwood's gardens, had called him to the big house weekly for lessons, ignoring his son Silas's disapproving looks, the whispered scandals among the other planters' wives. Why would a man like Tobias Thorne care about teaching a slave child violin? What had driven him to defy convention, to risk his community standing, to anger his own son? And now, 3 years after Tobias's death, his son had destroyed the instrument with a fury that seemed almost personal, almost desperate, as if he'd been seeking an excuse to do exactly that for years. Malachius burst through his cabin door, startling his mother, who was stirring a pot over the fire. Sarah Walker was a woman in her early 40s, who looked 10 years older. Her hands were work-roughened, her face lined with the accumulated weight of hardships survived. But her eyes remained sharp, intelligent, and they immediately perceived that something was wrong. "Malachius, what happened? Where's your violin?" He didn't answer. He went directly to the small table in the corner, serving as his workspace, swept aside the few items there, and carefully laid out the broken instrument's pieces. His hands were shaking now, and he forced himself to move slowly, deliberately. "Baby, what happened?" His mother was beside him now, her hand on his back. Then she saw the destruction, the splintered wood, and her breath hitched.
"Oh, Lord. Oh, Malachius. Who did this? Oh, Colonel Thorne."
His voice was flat, controlled, but his mother knew him well enough to hear the rage beneath it. Sarah's face hardened. "That devil. That evil, bitter devil. He's been looking for a reason ever since his daddy died." Ever since. She stopped abruptly, as if catching herself before saying something inappropriate. Malachius looked up at her sharply. "Ever since what, Mama?" "Nothing. I just meant ever since the colonel took over the plantation. Times have been hard for him." But something in her voice, something evasive that Malachius had never heard before. He studied his mother's face, noticing things he'd never observed. The way her eyes wouldn't quite meet his. The tension in her shoulders. The way her hand had unconsciously gone to her throat, touching a small scar there that she usually kept hidden. "Mama, what aren't you telling me?" "Nothing, baby. I'm just sorry about your violin. I know how much it meant to you." But Malachius was no longer listening. He had picked up the largest piece of the violin's back, the one with the strange crack, and was examining it in the light from the window. His fingers found the seam, worked at it gently. The wood was old, the glue weakened by time and the violence of its destruction. With a soft cracking sound, a section of the back panel separated, revealing a hollow space that should not have existed. Violins were solid instruments, their construction precise and uniform. There should not have been any hidden cavities, but there was. And inside it, carefully wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture and time, was something that made Malachius's heart begin pounding. It was a document. Several pages actually, folded and sealed with red wax that had cracked with age. The seal bore an imprint, a family crest that Malachius recognized immediately. It was the same crest appearing on Thornwood Plantation's iron gates, the Thorne family seal. His hands froze. He looked up at his mother, who had gone completely still, her eyes fixed on the folded papers with an expression of pure shock. Or was it fear? Or recognition? "Mama," he said slowly, "did you know this was here?" Sarah Walker's mouth opened, then closed. No words emerged. She looked from the documents to her son's face and back again. And in her eyes, Malachius saw confirmation. She had known. Perhaps not exactly what was hidden, but she had known there was something. Who was my father? The question emerged before Malachius even realized he was going to ask it. It was a question he had never asked before, a question his mother had always deflected with vague references to a good man who died before you were born. His mother's face went gray. "Malachius, don't. Who was he?" "Baby, please. Some things are better left. Who was he?" The shout filled the small cabin, echoing off the walls. His mother flinched as if struck. In the corner, his younger sister, Naomi, 10 years old, emerged from behind the curtain separating the sleeping area, her eyes wide with fear. Sarah Walker seemed to age 10 years in an instant. Her shoulders sagged, and she sank into the room's only chair, as if her legs would no longer support her. When she spoke, Her voice was barely audible. His name was Tobias Thorn. The world seemed to tilt. Malachius heard the words, understood them individually, but could not connect them into meaning. Tobias Thorn, the old master, the man who had taught him to play violin, the man who had given him the instrument on his deathbed. His father. "No," Malachius said. "No, that's not possible. I was 17, his mother said. And now the words were coming faster, as if a dam had broken. He was 45. I worked in the big house. I didn't have a choice, baby. You have to understand that. I didn't have a choice about anything back then." The implications crashed over Malachius like a wave. If Tobias Thorn was his father, then Colonel Silas Thorn was his half-brother. The man who had just destroyed his violin was family. And suddenly the colonel's rage, his personal hatred, made a terrible kind of sense. But there was more. If these documents bore the Thorn family seal, if Tobias had hidden them inside the violin, and then given that violin to his illegitimate son with such urgency, such insistence that it never be taken away, then what did they contain? Malachius's hands moved almost of their own accord, breaking the ancient wax seal and unfolding the pages. The paper was thick, expensive, the kind used for important legal documents. The handwriting was elegant, each letter perfectly formed. But the ink had faded to a rusty brown with age. He began to read, and with each line, each paragraph, each revelation, the small cabin seemed to grow larger. The world seemed to expand and contract simultaneously. It was a will, Tobias Thorn's last will and testament, written in his own hand, dated September 15, 1860, 5 years before the war ended, 9 years before this moment. But it wasn't the will that anyone had seen. It wasn't the will that had transferred Thornwood Plantation to Colonel Silas Thorn. It was something else entirely, something that Tobias had clearly intended to remain hidden until after his death, something that would protect it from being changed or destroyed while he still lived. Malachius's eyes raced across the pages, his breath coming faster. His mother was talking, asking questions, but he couldn't hear her. The words on the page were too loud, too impossible, too world-shattering. Tobias Thorn in this secret will had acknowledged Malachius by name, had called him his son, and had bequeathed to him. In recognition of the sin I committed in bringing him into this world without the protection of my name, and in hope of making some small recompense for that wrong, the entirety of Thornwood Plantation, including the house, the land, and all properties and assets associated with it. But there was more. Attached to the will was a separate document, older still, that made Malachius's blood run cold. It was a certificate of manumission dated 1858 that freed Sarah Walker and granted freedom to any children born to her, born or yet to be born. His mother had been freed 11 years ago. He had been free his entire life, but no one had known, because Tobias Thorn had hidden the document, had kept the secret, had allowed his own son to live as a slave even as the law said he was free. Why? Why would a man do such a thing? Malachius looked up from the pages, his mind reeling. His mother was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face, and Malachius understood in a flash of terrible insight why Tobias had hidden these documents even as he wrote them. Because in 1860 in the South, such revelations would have gotten Sarah killed, would have gotten Malachius killed, would have destroyed any chance they had of surviving. Tobias had waited, had kept the secret, had preserved the documents until after the war, until freedom came and made such truths survivable. But he had died too soon. He had died before he could reveal what he had done, before he could make the will public. And so he had hidden it in the one place where he knew it would eventually be found, in the one object that he knew would stay with his son, the violin. Malachius stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the rough wooden floor. His mind was racing, trying to understand the implications, trying to see the path forward. These documents, if they were authentic, if they could be verified, changed everything. They meant that Silas Thorne had been living in a house that didn't belong to him, managing a plantation that wasn't his, acting as master of an estate that had legally passed to someone else 9 years ago. But would anyone believe it? Would any court in Louisiana, in this fragile and violent time of Reconstruction, honor a will that left a white man's entire estate to his illegitimate black son? Or would these papers be dismissed as forgeries, as fantasies, as dangerous delusions? And more importantly, what would Silas Thorne do when he learned what these documents contained? Because Malachius suddenly understood with absolute certainty why the colonel had destroyed the violin with such fury. He had suspected. Maybe he hadn't known for sure. But he had suspected that his father had hidden something, had left something behind that would threaten Silas's claim to Thornwood. The colonel's strange reaction when he looked at the wreckage, his sudden departure toward the law offices, it all made a terrible kind of sense. Silas knew, or at least he feared. And a man like Silas Thorne, desperate and cornered, was capable of anything. "I have to go," Malachias said abruptly. His mother grabbed his arm. "We're, Malachias, what are you going to do?" "I'm going to find the federal marshal. I'm going to show him these documents." "No." Sarah's grip tightened, her fingernails digging into his skin. "Baby, no. You'll get yourself killed. The colonel has friends. He has guns. He has nothing."
Mama,
"Don't you see? According to these papers, he has nothing. Thornwood is mine. Has been mine since I was 11 years old. Papers don't mean anything if you're dead." Sarah was shouting now, something Malachias had never heard her do. "You think white folks in this town are going to let a black boy walk into court and claim ownership of the biggest plantation in the parish? You think they're going to honor your father's wishes? They'll call you a liar. They'll call you worse, and then they'll string you up from the nearest tree." She was right. Of course, Malachias knew she was right. The rational part of his mind, the part that had learned to navigate the dangerous waters of post-war Louisiana, was screaming at him to hide the documents, to leave town, to forget he had ever seen them. But another part of him, a part he had never fully acknowledged before, was burning with a righteous fury that would not be contained. His father had denied him in life, had kept him enslaved even as he wrote words of freedom, had watched him grow up in the fields while living in luxury in the big house. But in death, Tobias Thorne had tried to make amends. He had given Malachias not just freedom, but dignity, not just acknowledgement, but restitution, and Malachias would be damned if he let fear keep him from claiming what was rightfully his. "I'm going," he said quietly, gently removing his mother's hand from his arm. "I have to. You understand that, don't you?" Sarah looked at her son, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time, seeing not the boy she had raised, but the man he had become. She saw Tobias in his face, in the set of his jaw, in the determined glint in his eyes. And she saw something else, too, something that was purely Malachias, purely himself. "Then I'm coming with you," she said. "Mama, no. Don't argue. If you're going to do this fool thing, you're not doing it alone. Naomi, stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but us." The little girl nodded, her eyes huge in her small face, clearly not understanding what was happening, but sensing its gravity. Malachias carefully folded the documents and placed them inside his coat next to his heart. He took one last look at the destroyed violin on the table, at the instrument that had carried this secret for so many years. Then he and his mother walked out into the cold January afternoon, heading back toward the center of Lafayette. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the horizon. Malachias checked the time on the church clock as they passed. It was just after 200. 2 hours since the violin had been destroyed. 2 hours since his world had been shattered and remade. What would the next 2 hours bring? The federal marshal's office was on Bourbon Street in a Moditz building that had once housed a Confederate recruiting station. The irony was not lost on anyone. Marshal James Garrett was a Massachusetts man sent south as part of the Reconstruction Administration, and he was one of the few white officials in Louisiana whom the freedmen trusted to dispense anything resembling justice. But even Garrett had his limits. Even he had to live in this town, had to navigate the treacherous political waters between the old Confederate establishment and the new federal order. Would he be willing to enforce a claim as explosive as this one? They would find out soon enough. As they walked through the streets, Malachias noticed people staring. Word had already spread about the incident in the square. Some faces showed sympathy, others satisfaction, still others simple curiosity. But no one tried to stop them, and for that Malachias was grateful. They turned onto Bourbon Street, and the marshal's office came into view. And that was when Malachias saw the horse tied outside, a magnificent black stallion with the Thornwood brand on its flank. Colonel Silas Thorne was already there. Malachias's steps faltered. His mother grabbed his hand, squeezing hard. For a moment, they both stood frozen, uncertain. Then the office door opened, and Marshal Garrett emerged with the colonel at his side. The two men were talking in low, urgent voices. Garrett was in his mid-30s, tall and lean, with the weathered look of a former cavalry officer. He saw Malachias and his mother approaching, and something flickered across his face. Surprise, concern, or had he been expecting them? Colonel Thorne turned to see what had caught the marshal's attention, and when his eyes fell on Malachias, his face went through a rapid series of transformations. Shock, fear, rage, and finally something harder and colder settled into place. He looked at Malachias's coat, at the place where the documents were hidden, and a thin smile curved his lips. "Well," he said softly, "look who's here." "Colonel," Marshal Garrett said, his voice carefully neutral. "Perhaps you should. I'll stay." "Thank you, Marshal. I have a feeling this concerns me." Malachias forced himself to keep walking, to close the distance between them. He could feel the weight of the documents against his chest, could feel his mother's hand trembling in his. When he spoke, he was surprised by how steady his own voice sounded. "Marshal Garrett, I need to report a crime. Colonel Thorne destroyed my property this afternoon in the town square." "Hardly think a broken fiddle constitutes a federal offense, boy," Thorne said with a sneer. "It wasn't just a fiddle, sir. It was given to me by your father on his deathbed." Something flashed in Thorne's eyes. "My father gave away many things in his final illness. His mind was not sound." "His mind was perfectly sound," Malachias countered. "Sound enough to hide something that he wanted me to have. Something that you've been looking for." The colonel's jaw tightened. Marshal Garrett looked between the two men, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his holstered pistol. "What are you talking about, Malachias?" the marshal asked. Instead of answering, Malachias reached into his coat and pulled out the folded documents. He held them up, making sure both men could see the broken seal, the Thorne family crest. These were hidden inside the violin. My father, Tobias Thorne, put them there before he gave the instrument to me. They're legal documents, sir. A will and a certificate of manumission. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of the wind and the distant bark of a dog. Colonel Thorne had gone absolutely still, his face drained of color. Marshal Garrett's eyes widened slightly, But he maintained his professional composure. "Those are forgeries," Thorn said flatly. "Obvious forgeries. The boy made them himself." "I can verify my father's handwriting, Marshal," Malachius said, his heart pounding. "And I believe you can too. There are records in this office, documents that Tobias Thorn signed. Land deeds, tax records. Compare the handwriting." "Don't be absurd," Thorn snapped. "You expect us to believe that my father would leave Thornwood to you. It's ridiculous. Impossible." "Eyes it." Malachius met the Conal's eyes directly, seeing his own features reflected in that furious face. The same bone structure, the same arch of the eyebrows. How had he never noticed before? Is it impossible for a man to acknowledge his own blood? The words hung in the air like a blade. Sarah gasped softly, and Marshal Garrett's eyes darted from Malachius to Thorn and back again, understanding dawning. "Lies," Thorn hissed. "Vicious lies. Marshal, I demand that you arrest this boy for what, exactly?" Garrett's voice was quiet, but firm. "For having documents that may or may not be authentic." "Malachius, may I see those papers?" Malachius handed them over, watching as the Marshal unfolded them carefully and began to read. Garrett's face remained neutral, but his eyes moved faster as he progressed through the text. When he finished, he looked up at Malachius with an expression that was difficult to read. "These are serious allegations," he said finally. "If authentic, these documents would represent a significant transfer of property. But authentication will take time. I'll need to compare handwriting samples, possibly bring in expert witnesses, consult with the federal court in Baton Rouge." "How long?" Malachius asked. "Weeks. Maybe months. During which time," Conal Thorn interjected smoothly, having recovered some of his composure, "this boy will be free to concoct whatever story he likes, to gather supposed witnesses, to create a web of lies designed to steal my family's property." "Your family's property?" Malachius's voice rose despite himself. "You mean the property you inherited through a will that no one ever saw? The will that appeared conveniently after your father's death, with no witnesses to its signing?" "There were witnesses," Thorn shouted. "Decker, Harrison and Judge Peyton. Both your friends." Malachius shot back. "Both men who owed your father money." "That's enough." Marshal Garrett stepped between them. "Both of you back up." "Conal, Malachius raises a valid point. The will you probated was never recorded before your father's death, which is unusual for a man of his wealth and standing. He was ill. He made his final arrangements at the last moment like many men do." "Perhaps." Garrett turned to Malachius. "And you, son, must understand that what you're claiming would overturn settled law, settled property rights. Even if these documents are authentic, proving their validity in court will be an uphill battle." "I understand, sir." Do you understand that half the men in this town would rather see you hang than see you inherit Thornwood? Do you understand the danger you've put yourself and your family in?" Malachius felt his mother's hand tighten in his own. He understood. Of course he understood, but he also understood something else. Something that had crystallized in his mind as he stood there facing his half-brother across the dusty street. "Marshal, with respect, I've been in danger my whole life. Every day I've been alive, I've been in danger of being beaten, killed, sold away from my family, or worse. The only thing that's changed is now I have a chance to be in danger for something that matters. For something that's mine." Garrett studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, I'll take the documents into custody for authentication. In the meantime, both of you are to stay away from each other. Conal, that means no retaliation. Malachius, that means no attempts to take possession of Thornwood or any of its assets. Are we clear?" "Perfectly," Thorn said coldly. "Yes, sir," Malachius agreed. But as the marshal took the documents and turned to go back into his office, Colonel Thorne leaned close to Malachias and spoke in a voice so low that only he could hear it. "You've made the biggest mistake of your life, boy. My father was a fool and a race traitor, but I'm not. You'll never see a penny of Thornwood. And if you persist in this insanity, you'll find that accidents happen all the time in Louisiana, particularly to uppity queen who don't know their place." Before Malachias could respond, Thorne had turned and mounted his horse, riding away without a backward glance. Sarah pulled her son close, her whole body trembling. "He's going to kill you," she whispered. "You know that, don't you? He's going to kill you before he lets you take that plantation." "Maybe," Malachias said, "but maybe not. There are witnesses now. The marshal knows. If anything happens to me, it will look suspicious. You think that will stop him?" Malachias didn't answer because he didn't know. Instead, he led his mother back toward their cabin, his mind racing with everything that had happened in the past 2 hours. 2 hours ago, he had been a young freedman with nothing but a violin and a dream. Now, he was the potential heir to one of the largest plantations in Louisiana, the acknowledged son of one of the parish's most prominent families. But he was also perhaps a marked man. They reached home as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that looked like fire. Naomi opened the door before they could knock, throwing herself into her mother's arms. The little girl had been crying, and it took several minutes to calm her down and assure her that everything was all right. But was it all right? Malachias stood at the window, looking out at the gathering darkness, and wondered what the night would bring. Would Thorne send men? Would there be violence? Or would the colonel try something more subtle, more legal? Hours passed. Sarah made dinner, but none of them could eat much. They sat together in the small cabin, listening to every sound outside, jumping at every creak and groan of the old boards. But nothing happened. No one came. The night stretched on, long and anxious. Finally, near midnight, there was a knock at the door. Malachias's hand went to the knife he kept on his belt, and Sarah pushed Naomi behind her. They froze, staring at the door as if it might sprout fangs. "Malachias Walker." A voice called from outside. "It's Marshal Garrett. I need to speak with you." Cautiously, Malachias opened the door. The marshal stood there in the moonlight, his face grave. He was alone, which was either a good sign or a very bad one. "Marshal, what's happened? I need you to come with me now." "Why? What's wrong?" Garrett glanced at Sarah and Naomi, then back at Malachias. "There's been an incident at Thornwood. Colonel Thorne is dead." The words didn't make sense at first. Malachias heard them, processed them, but couldn't quite believe them. Dead? How could he be dead? It had only been a few hours since they had stood facing each other in the street. "How?" he managed to ask. "That's what I need to determine. You need to come with me, Malachias. You may be a suspect." "A suspect." Sarah's voice was shrill with fear. "He's been here all night. We all have. I believe you, Mrs. Walker. But there are procedures that must be followed. And there's something at the scene that you need to see, Malachias. Something that changes everything." The ride to Thornwood in Marshal Garrett's wagon was surreal, like moving through a dream. The plantation looked different at night, its white columns ghostly in the moonlight, its windows dark and lifeless. There were several other horses tied outside and lights moving inside the house. Garrett led Malachias through the front door, something he had never done before, always having entered through the back when he was summoned for violin lessons, and into the library. It was a grand room lined with books, dominated by a massive mahogany desk, and behind that desk, slumped in the leather chair, was Colonel Silas Thorne, or what was left of him. The colonel's head had fallen forward onto the desk, and there was blood. A lot of blood. But it wasn't the bullet wound in his temple that made Malachias's breath catch. It was what was clutched in the colonel's right hand. A pistol. And on the desk, weighted down with a crystal paperweight, was a letter. Suicide, Marshal Garrett said quietly. Or that's what it's meant to look like. But I need you to read this before I make any official determination. He handed Malachias the letter. It was written in a shaky hand, very different from the elegant script Malachias had seen in the documents from the Violin. But the signature at the bottom was unmistakably Silas Thorne's. The letter was a confession. In it, Thorne admitted to falsifying his father's will, to bribing Dr. Harrison and Judge Peyton to lie about witnessing its signing. He wrote about his hatred for his half-brother, about his shame at his father's relationship with Sarah, about his desperate attempts to keep the truth hidden. And he wrote about how, when he saw the broken violin in the square and realized what it might contain, he knew his deception was finished. I cannot live with the shame, the letter concluded. I cannot face the world knowing that I stole what rightfully belonged to another. My father was weak, but he was honest in his final act. I have been neither. May God forgive me? Malachias read the letter 3 times, each reading leaving him more confused. It was too convenient, too perfect, too exactly what he needed to claim Thornwood without any legal challenge. Marshal, he said slowly, this doesn't feel right. No, Garrett agreed. It doesn't. But the question is, what's wrong with it? Is it a genuine suicide note from a man overcome with guilt? Or is it murder made to look like suicide? And if it's murder, who did it? And why make it so convenient for you? That was the question that kept Malachias awake for what remained of that night, and all through the next day. Who would benefit from Thorne's death? Obviously, he would. But he had an alibi, and while his mother and sister might lie for him, several neighbors had been in and out of their cabin that evening, checking on them, offering support. There were plenty of witnesses to place him far from Thornwood when the colonel died. So who else? Who else knew about the documents? Who else had reason to want Thorne dead? The answer came 2 days later, when Marshal Garrett returned to the cabin with news. He had found inconsistencies in the supposed suicide note, details that suggested Thorne had been forced to write it. More importantly, he had found evidence that someone else had been in the library that night. Boot prints in the blood, smaller than Thorne's, leading away from the scene, and he had found the person those prints belonged to. It was Dr. Harrison, the physician who had supposedly witnessed Tobias Thorne's will. When confronted, the doctor had broken down and confessed everything. Harrison had been in debt to Tobias Thorne, had been facing financial ruin. When the old man died, Silas had offered him a way out, lie about witnessing a will that left everything to Silas, and the debt would be forgiven. Harrison had agreed, seeing no harm in it. After all, why shouldn't a man's property go to his legitimate son? But when Malachias appeared with documents that proved the fraud, Harrison had panicked. If the truth came out, he would lose his medical license, possibly face criminal charges. He had gone to Thornwood to beg Silas to find a way to suppress the documents, to make the problem disappear. Instead, he found the colonel in his library drinking heavily, ranting about his father's betrayal, about the humiliation of losing everything to a black bastard. And Harrison, seeing his own ruin reflected in Thorne's despair, had made a desperate decision. He had taken the colonel's pistol from its drawer, forced him to write the confession at gunpoint, and then pulled the trigger. It was meant to look like suicide, meant to end the controversy before it began. In his twisted logic, Harrison had believed he was helping Malachius, giving him an uncontested claim to Thornwood. He hadn't counted on Malachius's suspicion, or Marshal Garrett's thoroughness, or his own inability to live with what he had done. The trial was mercifully brief. Harrison was convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. Judge Peyton, the other false witness, fled Louisiana rather than face prosecution, and the documents from the violin, now authenticated by experts in Baton Rouge, were declared valid and legally binding. On March 3, 1869, less than 2 months after Colonel Thorne had destroyed his violin in the town square, Malachius Walker took possession of Thornwood Plantation. He stood on the front steps of the great house, looking out over the fields where he had once worked as a slave, and tried to comprehend the impossible transformation his life had undergone. His mother stood beside him, and his sister, and Reverend Johnson, and dozens of other freedmen who had come to witness this moment. Some were weeping, some were singing. All of them knew they were watching history being made, watching the old order crumble and something new, something better, struggling to be born. But Malachius felt no triumph, only a profound sadness. He thought about Tobias Thorne, the father who had never claimed him in life, who had taught him music but not how to be a son. He thought about Silas, the half-brother he had never known, whose hatred had consumed him utterly. He thought about Dr. Harrison, now awaiting execution, whose greed and fear had led him to murder. And he thought about the violin, destroyed but ultimately fulfilling its purpose, carrying its secret through the years until the moment when it could be revealed. That evening, as the sun set over Thornwood, Malachius sat on the front porch of the house that was now his. In his hands, he held the pieces of the violin that he had carefully preserved. He had asked several craftsmen about repairing it, but all had said the same thing. It was beyond saving. The damage was too extensive. The instrument was dead. But Malachius kept the pieces anyway, displayed them in a glass case in the library where Silas had died. He wanted to remember. He wanted anyone who visited Thornwood to see those broken fragments and understand that sometimes destruction is necessary for truth to emerge. That sometimes things must be broken before they can be made whole. He hired teachers and opened a school on the plantation for freedmen's children. He divided the land, giving parcels to families who had once worked it as slaves, transforming Thornwood from a monument to oppression into something like a community. He learned to play piano, since violin was now impossible. And in the evenings, he would play in the library, filling the house with music it had rarely heard. And sometimes late at night, he would take out the pieces of destroyed violin and run, his fingers over the broken wood, feeling the hollow space where the documents had been hidden. And he would wonder about the strange path his life had taken. If Colonel Thorne had not destroyed the violin, would the truth ever have emerged? If Tobias had lived a year longer, would he have had the courage to reveal what he had done? If Malachius had been less curious, less persistent, would he have simply walked away from the broken instrument and never discovered its secret? He would never know the answers to these questions, but he knew this. 2 hours had changed everything. 2 hours between destruction and revelation, between despair and hope, between one life and another entirely. The violin had been destroyed, but in its destruction, it had done what its music never could. It had told the truth. It had righted a wrong. It had transformed a slave into a master, not through violence or vengeance, but through the patient keeping of a secret until the moment was right for it to be known. Years later, when Malachius was an old man and Thornwood had become a thriving community, a visitor asked him about the broken violin in the glass case. Why keep such a sad reminder of violence and destruction? Malachias smiled and touched the glass gently, as if the instrument might still feel his caress. "Because," he said, "some things have to be broken before their true purpose can be revealed. That violin carried me across an impossible distance. It brought me from bondage to freedom, from invisibility to recognition, from poverty to prosperity. But it could only do that by being destroyed. Sometimes the most beautiful music isn't the sound an instrument makes, but the silence it leaves behind, and what that silence allows us to hear." The visitor didn't understand, but that was all right. Malachias understood. He understood that his father, flawed and cowardly as he had been in life, had given him two gifts. The first was music, the ability to create beauty in a world that often had none. The second was justice, delayed but not denied, hidden but not lost. And he understood that Connell Thorne, in his hatred and violence, had inadvertently become the instrument of that justice. By destroying the violin, he had released the truth it contained. By trying to erase Malachias's last possession, he had given him everything. It was, Malachias often thought, the strangest kind of poetry, the kind that could only be written in a world as broken and complex as the one he lived in, where right and wrong tangled together like the strings of a violin, where the same act could be both destruction and revelation, where 2 hours could contain an entire lifetime of change. He lived another 40 years after that January day in 1869, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1909 at the age of 63. Thornwood passed to his children and then to theirs, remaining in the family for generations. The school he founded grew into a college, educating thousands of young people who might otherwise have had no chance at learning. And in the library, in its glass case, the broken violin remained, a reminder that sometimes the most important truths are the ones that stay hidden until the moment is right. That sometimes destruction is the doorway to justice. And that sometimes the distance between despair and hope is measured not in miles or years, but in hours, just 2 hours. 2 hours that changed everything. The story of Malachias Walker and his violin became legend in Lafayette. It was told and retold, embellished and mythologized until it was hard to separate fact from fiction. But the essential truth remained. A young black man had inherited one of the largest plantations in Louisiana through a combination of his father's belated conscience and his half-brother's violent rage. It was a story that captured the contradictions of Reconstruction, the possibilities and perils of that brief moment when anything seemed possible, when the old order had fallen but the new one had not yet been established. It was a story about secrets and revelations, about the power of truth and the cost of lies, about what fathers owe their sons and what sons inherit from their fathers. And at the center of it all was a violin, destroyed but not forgotten, its fragments preserved behind glass as a testament to the idea that sometimes we must lose everything to gain what is rightfully ours. That sometimes the breaking of one thing is necessary for the building of another, and that sometimes the most profound changes come not gradually over time, but suddenly, in the space of just 2 hours. 2 hours that shocked a town, transformed a life, and reminded everyone who heard the story that justice, though often delayed, can arrive in the most unexpected ways, hidden in the most unlikely places, waiting only for the right moment to be revealed.